Yeah.
Recording is okay. I welcome you all to the Cleveringa lecture 2024. Of course, it's a bit weird to have it now in 2025. But as you remember, the 26th of November, the usual date of the... As usual, you go to your safe place and you stay there for 10 minutes. And after that, you can come back and we will still be here.
Yeah, we leave the Zoom on.
Okay, I think it works now. The Cleveringa lecture is a yearly project by the Alumni Association of Dutch alumni in Israel, the Dutch Embassy, and the Irgoen Olei Holland, and the Leiden University Fund. I'm very happy that it is possible to have such a project together with a Dutch university. And now I want to invite Deputy Ambassador Benjamin Anker to tell us a little bit about his study in Leiden and the connection with Professor Rudolf Cleveringa. Benjamin moet ontmoeten. Ja.
Yeah.
Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Super. Thank you, Gaia. And welcome, everybody. My name is Benjamin Anker. I am the Deputy Ambassador of the Netherlands to Israel. Relatively new in this role. I started in August of 2024, so a few months before this lecture should have taken place in the original planning. But I've been in the country a bit longer. I lived in Jerusalem for 3 years before I moved into this job. So I'm not entirely new. I am the Deputy Ambassador here, but in the past, I was actually in Leiden at Leiden University, as Gaia indicated. I am a lawyer by education. I studied law at Leiden University. A part of my family is from the wider Leiden area. And in that sense, I'm especially honored and happy to say a few words of welcome to you tonight, and to also say something about my connection to the story of Professor Cleveringa. Because I think everybody in the call will know that the story of Professor Cleveringa is not only about one speech that he delivered on the 26th of November in 1940. There is much behind it, many things that preceded it, and there's a whole story that came after. And if you allow me, I want to say a few things about that. Because to understand the story of Professor Cleveringa and his lecture and the impact, I think we have to go back to the days of 1940, where the claws of Nazi Germany were tightening on the Netherlands. And in that ambience, the University of Leiden was confronted with several measures. The first was actually about the staff of the university having to declare that it was Aryan, and that was a wider measure that the Germans took in the Netherlands, but it also affected the staff at Leiden University. And then the second measure that came, and that was in November 1940, was about the prohibition of Jewish staff to actually teach at Leiden University. That was not specific. It was a measure that actually applied to everyone who was serving in public life in the Netherlands at the time. And the interesting thing is the story of Professor Cleveringa is not so much about himself, it's about other people that he wanted to protect. And in this story, that other person, or the most important person in that story, was Professor Meyers. Professor Meyers was an eminent lawyer. I think he became a professor at the age of 30 already in 1910, and he rose to fame in pre-war Europe because he had honorary doctorates also outside the Netherlands. I think Belgium, Italy, etc. He was a very fine and brilliant lawyer, widely acknowledged. And this Professor Meyer, he was one of the victims of this measure taken by Nazi Germany that indicated that no longer Jews would be able to teach at the university. And in the story, Professor Cleveringa stood up, not only within the board of the university, saying that we should not allow this to happen, but also in stepping forward and actually taking over a lecture that Professor Meyers was supposed to deliver on the 26th of November 1940 to his law students. And he did not show up because of the measure, but Professor Cleveringa did. And he stood up and he delivered a speech to the students, which was not dramatic, it was not full of emotion, it was about principle, and it was about the merits of Professor Meyer and what he had done for the science of law, Leiden University, and science in general. And I think the remarkable thing about the story is that Professor Cleveringa was not just protecting the university, he was not just protecting Professor Meyers, he was acting in civil courage, so to speak, to stand up for this professor and his right to teach. Some of you who have been to Leiden, who have been to one of the university buildings or even have studied there, may know that if you take the coat of arms of Leiden University, it says Praesidium Libertatis. Praesidium Libertatis. This is a bastion of freedom. And this principle, this should be a bastion of freedom, because otherwise an institution like this university cannot function. It cannot exist. That was as true in 1575 when the university was founded, as it was on the 26th of November of 1940, as it is today in 2025. Professor Cleveringa stood up courageously and the students followed him. The students followed him because they copied the speech that he delivered and they spread it out to other faculties and to other university cities. And actually the next day the students went on strike and the university was closed down by the Germans as a consequence, and it did not reopen for many years. I'm telling you this story not sort of to highlight how courageous Leiden University was at the time or how exemplary was Professor Cleveringa when it came to the attitude of Dutch people during the Second World War. Unfortunately, we all know better. It was a very remarkable event by the professor and the institution standing up, but many other institutions in the Netherlands did not stand up. Many other individuals did not stand up either. And if we look back at the event of the speech of Professor Cleveringa at that point, what is then the reason why we are still commemorating that every year? Why are we organizing Cleveringa lectures, not only in the Netherlands on an annual basis, but also in many places of the world? It's because it serves as a reminder that we cannot take it for granted that people will stand up. And I think we all know that for a long period of time, but increasingly so after the 7th of October 2023, we have seen a huge rise in anti-Semitic incidents, crimes in many parts of the world, and I'm sorry to say, also in the Netherlands. And the sort of ultimate low point of that development in the Netherlands, I guess, was a sort of outburst of violence after the football match between Maccabi and Ajax in November of last year, where many people disbehaved or misbehaved, I must say. But we ended up in a situation where we saw once again that words of hatred are so easily translated into acts of violence against Jews. And this is why we commemorate, right? Why we organize this lecture. I'm very happy that Gaia, the colleagues, the friends of IOH, Irgoen Olei Holland, Leiden University Fund, the volunteers from the alumni community that are involved in this, realize that this is still worth organizing to remind us of of the need to do it. There is a good part of the story when it comes to both Professor Cleveringa and Professor Myers, the eminent lawyer, because they both survived the Second World War. Professor Myers, he returned to his old job, and he was asked by the government to come up with a draft of the civil code, a new civil code for the Netherlands, which he worked on, I think, until his death in 1954. And he did such a good job, virtually on his own, that when he passed away, they needed an entire team to replace him. And to keep up the pace of his work, it took another, well, nearly 40 years before this new civil code was introduced. And that is the civil code I was taught in when I was at Leiden University. And Professor Cleveringa also came back to public life, and he served on the Council of State, which is, of course, one of the highest legal bodies in the Netherlands. But just to come back to why are we doing this today, why I'm honored to be with you tonight, and very grateful for those who are organizing it year after year, this point of it is not the time to become complacent about the values that Professor Cleveringa stood up for, not only freedom of the university, but the fight for the rights of all individuals in the Netherlands and elsewhere to be treated in an equal, undiscriminatory way, and that anti-Semitism is still one of the great evils of our time. I'm very happy that we can acknowledge that tonight. And I'm also happy that my government, the government of the Netherlands, has taken up the task of fighting anti-Semitism even harder, or a lot harder, after what we saw in November 2024, with a whole new strategy to work on that. Prosecute those who misbehave, educate those who do not know or who do not want to remember, and make sure that through all layers of society, the values that Professor Cleveringa represented are enshrined into the people we get from school, our personal lives, and the way we treat each other, whether it's from an institutional point of view or a personal point of view. Professor Cleveringa taught us something about this civil courage, about the vigilance that we need to stand up for these values and to share them. And I can only hope that tonight's lecture will not only remind us, but also inspire us to follow in his footsteps whenever our moment comes. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Benjamin. Now I want to introduce Professor Jessica Roitman to you. Is she here?
I'm here.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I saw that you were out of
No, the Zoom dropped out a few minutes.
I saw that. Okay, so Jessica Roitman, why did we invite her? The professor or other lecturer of the Cleveringa Lezing lecture always has to be someone with a link with Leiden and Leiden University, of course. Professor Roitman was a PhD student at Leiden University, but that was after she already had a whole life behind her. She was born in Kentucky and traveled over the world. She taught English in Brazil. She was on the Siberian Railway, Trans-Siberian Railway, and got to Irkutsk, and from there she did many other things, like working in a kibbutz, which is also a very good thing to do, long ago. And from all these things, she decided to proceed with her studies. She then already had an BA, magna cum laude, from Maryville College, and summa cum laude MA from Vanderbilt University, and this she continued in a place for a PhD in Leiden University. So she came to live in the Netherlands, and since then she stayed there for 25 years already. And she became a professor, full professor, not so long ago in 2021. And she is a full professor now at Free University in Amsterdam, Jewish Studies, the Faculty of Religion and Theology, Texts and Traditions. She knows a lot about Amsterdam Jewish tradition, and she developed into being a social and cultural historian. I can do no better than give you now the floor to give your lecture.
Great. Thanks so much, Chaya, and thank you, Benjamin, for the lovely introduction. It really is an honor to be speaking to you all this evening. I appreciate everyone's time, where it's getting late or early throughout the world, whoever's tuning in. And I'd also like to echo the thanks to the Irgoen Olei Holland and the Dutch Alumni Network. Particularly, I do want to thank you, Chaya, for inviting me, for organizing my talk. Lots of emails back and forth. I appreciate it. And also Marian Lefkowitz-Bomberger, also for helping me. And Marian is kindly going to be running my PowerPoint presentation, which I hope you all can also see. As Chaya said, this evening's also been supported by the Leiden University Fund, the Embassy of the Netherlands and Israel. Benjamin just talked to us, so I'm grateful to all of them for helping make this possible. So now I'll just get into my talk and hope we've got time afterwards to have questions, discussion. So the most recent Pew Research Center survey, and it's already nearly 5 years old, asserts that a little over 8% of American Jews would describe themselves as Jews of color. This study was really controversial within the Jewish community in the US. Doubts were cast upon its methodologies, and more generally, though, about what this small but growing minority meant for American Judaism. And that's especially because this same study estimates that by the end of this decade, so 2029, 2030, about 15% of American Jews will be Jews of color. But as I want to illustrate in my talk in the next half hour or so, discussions of race, of belonging, and who is or who isn't Jewish are nothing new, especially in the Americas. And I'll start by discussing this issue amongst the, quote, new Jews. That's a term coined by the great scholar of the Western Sephardim, Joseph Kaplan. So I'll discuss this issue amongst these new Jews in Amsterdam in the early 17th century. I'll then move us across the ocean to the Americas, focusing on the Caribbean colonies of the Dutch and the English in the 17th and 18th centuries. And then I'll contextualize and explain more about Jewish settlement in these spaces. And then I'll zoom out, no pun intended with zoom, and talk more broadly about what this engagement with colonialism and issues of race has meant for Jews at the time, but also what lessons I think that we can draw from these historical experiences. So Marian, if you would put the new slide up for people to see, the next slide. In a story that's likely familiar to many of you all, from the late 16th century onwards, more and more Sephardic Jews from Spain and Portugal found their way to Amsterdam. And these Jews went by, oh, Marian, I can see it, but I think you need to do the slideshow view. Anyway, I'll just keep on. So these Jews went by various names, the Portuguese, Hebrews of the Portuguese nation, or even just Nassau, which means nation in Portuguese. And actually, Marian, I think you can move to the next slide already. There, great, thank you. They were of New Christian or crypto-Jewish descent. And in Amsterdam, which was relatively tolerant of Judaism, many returned to the open practice of the faith of their ancestors. And actually that picture on the slide there is a famous engraving of the Portuguese synagogue, the Snoa, which still stands to this day, was built in the latter part of the 17th century. With the arrival of the Portuguese, substantial numbers of people of African descent came to the city for the first time as well. From the 15th century onwards, with the advent of Portuguese overseas expansion, sub-Saharan Africans were ever more present in the Iberian Peninsula. And there's some discussion and some debate about whether they were enslaved, and if so, what enslavement meant in this European context. But in any case, usually they worked in some domestic roles. And some of these new Christian families from Portugal brought these servants or slaves with them to the Netherlands, or the Dutch Republic at the time, either from Iberia directly or else later in the century from the Americas. I'm seeing the sign louder, please. I have my microphone up as high as it will go, but I'll try to speak more loudly. Either from Iberia directly or later in the century from the Americas. And as early as the first quarter of the 17th century, this presence was remarked on. And the quote I put is from Ernst Brink. He was later to become the mayor of Harderwijk, which is a town in the province of North Holland. And he wrote about his visit to Amsterdam, and he'd made a grand tour through the Low Countries. And he noted that, and I quote, most of the Portuguese, being largely Jews, live in Joda Breestraat and also have a house where they gather. He's talking about an informal synagogue. Almost all of their servants are slaves and Moors, unquote. So he's noting already this connection between Jews and these Moors, which was a term used, some of you know Shakespeare, Othello, was used at the time to talk about people that looked Black in some way. And Marian, next slide, please. We should note actually that slavery was not officially allowed in the Dutch Republic. Nevertheless, the line between servant and slave seems to have been a fluid one. Take, for instance, the case of Domingos. This was uncovered by historian and archivist Mark Ponte. Domingos made a declaration to an Amsterdam notary in August of 1612. It was about a theft he witnessed. And what's interesting for us is that in this notarial act, he is listed as the Black slave of Dr. Francisco Lopez Henriquez, who is also known by the Jewish name of David Farrar. The presence of Black servants or slaves in the Sephardic community can also be seen in Romein de Hoog's prints of the Portuguese community. So I put one there on the slide. These are from the last quarter of the 17th century, as well as in various works of Rembrandt, also see on the slide as well. But what to do with these servants or slaves in life, but also, as I'll talk about in a second, in death, was a topic of secular law, documented in these notarial acts, like the one I just described to you. But it also was becoming an issue of religious law. So according to halakha, or Jewish law, an enslaved person owned by a Jew had to undergo a ritual at the beginning and the end of his or her service. And this ritual included circumcision for men and a ritual bath for men and women. And this permitted Jews to have slaves for a period of 12 months, after which the enslaved person became a full-fledged Jew. Now, I should say that there's lots of back and forth with laws about this. And the real expert, and I quote him a few times, is Jonathan Schorst, who goes really into all these differences in laws about enslavement amongst Jews. But anyway, however, if the enslaved person did not voluntarily embrace the Jewish faith, the owner was obligated to sell his or her enslaved person to non-Jews. And one way to circumvent this was by giving the enslaved person to another Jew as a gift before the end of the 12 months. Some inquisitorial archives pursued by historian and also real expert on this, Jonathan Eliezer de Molta in Torre de Tombo in Portugal, reveal this practice amongst the Sephardim in the 16th century, although these cases are always outside Iberia, as we have to keep in mind that the open practice of Judaism wasn't permitted anywhere on the Iberian Peninsula at the time. But what happened to these African Blacks in Amsterdam who didn't embrace the Jewish faith? And indeed, it's a question were any considered themselves or were considered by the community as being Jewish. So Marion, if we can have the new slide. The communal records of the early Portuguese Jewish community in Amsterdam show that it was becoming a problem for them to deal with these African servants who didn't become part of the community. Or maybe it would even be better for me to say weren't allowed to become part of the community. In 1627, the Ma'amad, that's the Board of Trustees of the Portuguese Jewish community, gathered in the house of Benjamin de Israel to establish regulations on behalf of the community. And as you can read in this slide, there seems to have been concern about the boundaries of the community and regulating those boundaries. In fact, the worry seems to have been about incorporating these people into the community. This could have been due to some sort of racism, but it may also have been due to the regulations imposed upon the community, the Portuguese Jewish community, by the city magistrates of Amsterdam. And keep in mind that Jewish settlement in Amsterdam was conditional. It was based upon the municipality. For instance, Jews couldn't settle in Utrecht until the very end of the 18th century. So Jews at the time were very concerned about being allowed to stay where they are. And the magistrates in Amsterdam were deeply concerned about conversions to Judaism. They did not want people converting to Judaism, and they were very clear that this Jewish community could stay as long as they were not converting people to Judaism. Of course, the magistrates seem to have been mostly worried about Dutch Christians, especially Dutch Reformed or Dutch Protestant Christians, not these people of African descent. Nevertheless, this may have also played into the Mahamad's ruling. Marion, if you could give me the new slide, please. So the oldest registers of the Portuguese cemetery in Oudekerk aan de Amstel, the Jewish cemetery had to be outside the city of Amsterdam in a village outside there, some kilometers away. So these oldest registers of the Portuguese cemetery there confirmed the fluidity or the confusion about the status of these African descended people, despite the pretty strong statement from the Ma'amad that I transcribed and translated and was on the last slide. These burial registers mention negras, escravas, so enslaved women, mulatas, so mixed race women that are buried there. On the 28th of September, 1629, for example, an escrava, so female slave of Abraham Aboaf, was buried next to another escrava, female slave of David Neto. And the most famous of these slaves or servants is the young man Eliezer, who was buried also in 1629. His grave, which you can see there on the slide, has become a pilgrimage site for the Afro-Dutch community to mark the beginning of enslavement in what's now the Netherlands and its overseas possessions. A ceremony is held at his graves and flowers are laid at the statue, which you see there, that was erected in his memory on Kettikolti. Kettikolti is a celebration on the 1st of July every year and commemorates the emancipation of enslaved people in Dutch territories in 1863. And these examples show that the Sephardim, or the Portuguese Jews, grappled with issues of race and belonging almost from the inception of these communities outside of Iberia. And these issues would only become more pronounced with their immigration to the colonies in the Americas. So Marianne, if we can have a new slide. Thank you. As many of you all know, over the course of the 17th century, beginning in the 1650s, Jewish communities were established throughout the Caribbean. Some of the more significant communities were in Dutch Brazil, which was relatively short-lived, or far more longer-lasting in Curacao and Suriname. And I'll focus on those communities this evening. but there were also numerically significant and important communities in English Jamaica and Barbados, and later in North America. And the slide shows where some of these Jewish settlements were. So why, you may be asking, only in the Dutch and English territories? Quite simply, openly Jewish settlement wasn't allowed anywhere other than in the Dutch and English territories. Jews were expelled from the French Caribbean with the implementation of what's called the Code Noir in 1685. The code dictated that only Catholics were allowed to settle in France's overseas colonies, and Jews were prohibited from professing their faith openly in the Spanish Caribbean. So if we can have a new slide. And the British and Dutch actually competed to attract Jews to their colonies in the Americas. The picture on the slide is from the synagogue in Livorno, actually from the 19th century, where advertisements were passed out by the Dutch to promote their American colonies amongst the Sephardic congregations there. And do keep in mind that right now I'm talking mostly of Sephardic or Portuguese Jews in the 17th century. Ashkenazi Jews would later begin to trickle in, especially to Suriname, but also to Jamaica later in the 18th century. But both empires had trouble attracting settlers for the reasons you can read on the slide. Not many people wanted to go to these places. Even the most lyrical promotional literature about the Americas had to admit that the new settlers would likely go through a period of sickness due to the unhealthy climate. It was also the sort of what's called actually in Dutch historiography, the Golden Age. It was for the Dutch Republic, and to a lesser extent also in England, meaning there was less economic motivation for people to leave home and to settle in these colonies. And the English and Dutch wanted settlers to counter the Spanish and Portuguese head start in capturing and controlling territories in the Americas. Keep in mind that the Spanish especially, but also the Portuguese, had started basically taking over the Americas in the 1500s. They also wanted to bolster their economies with lucrative colonial products such as wood, dyes, furs, tobacco, and very especially sugar. And I've also speculated in the past in articles I've written about less prosaic and more theological reasons behind Dutch and English recruitment of Jews to go to the Americas. The 17th century, as some of you all may know, showed an increasingly acute expectation of apocalyptic events by Christians and Jews. And this was marked by an outpouring of messianic prophecy all over Europe and the Mediterranean. Some of you may know the story of Zwarte Zwie, the or false Messiah, but many Jewish communities, including some people in Amsterdam, believed that he was the Messiah. Some interpretation of scripture, particularly one mysterious passage, Daniel 7, pointed to the idea that Jews must be dispersed all over the world, as they had been, but including this new world, the Americas, before the Messiah would come again. Oliver Cromwell's readmission of the Jews to England in 1656 was also possibly influenced by this messianism. But the English and Dutch also wanted permanent settlers rather than absentee landlords. And absentee landlords were pretty common at the time and actually stayed pretty common. These were people who owned land but didn't stay in the colonies. They had what Governor of Suriname, Johan Mauritius, in 1743 termed animus revertende, a desire to return to Europe. And the English and Dutch gambled that the Jews would remain in the colonies. And in this, they were actually right. Jews made up a third to a half of the white population in Dutch colonies by the middle of the 18th century. And there are still very small communities, Jewish communities in Suriname, Curacao, Jamaica, and a few other Caribbean places to this day. So if I can have a new slide. And the Dutch and English offered Jews expanded rights and privileges, often offering more liberties, and that's what they were called at the time, liberties, than Jewish communities had in Europe, if they would go to these American colonies. These special privileges were originally hammered out for the early Dutch settlement in Essequibo. It's now in Guyana. What used to be British Guiana, now it's independent, just Guyana, on the so-called Wild Coast. This region is now an economic backwater. You have French Guiana, Suriname, and Guyana. But in the 17th century, it was hotly contested between the French, the Dutch, and the English, all of whom wanted a toehold on the South American continent. This was to counter the Spanish and Portuguese who controlled the rest of the continent. And these privileges, they're also termed privileges, were known as the Essequibo liberties, as you see on the slide. They became the blueprint, as historian Wim Klooster terms it, for the rights and privileges given to Jewish communities throughout the Dutch and English Americas. And you can read what these were on the slide. And now another slide. Thank you. And it was against this backdrop of geopolitical, economic, territorial tensions and goals that by the early 18th century, there were synagogues, so not just Jewish communities, which we had from the middle of the 17th century, but actual synagogues throughout the Caribbean basin, several of which, Curacao, St. Thomas, Jamaica, are distinguished by their white sand floors. There's a lot of debate about where the white sand comes from. We can talk about that in the discussion if you want. But in any case, the new reality of the Americas with its fluid systems of race, class, and economics, and keep in mind that a lot of the economics are based upon the trade in sugar, other colonial goods that are very dependent on enslaved labor. As some of you know the story, the indigenous Native Americans died off very quickly. They were considered unsuitable for this kind of labor, and it began the importation of enslaved Africans. But this new reality of the Americas provided, I think, a unique backdrop for the exploration of traditional Jewish communal structures and legal systems. Jewish communities grappled with these questions of race, slavery, diaspora, identity. In many ways, Jewish communities followed the broader trends established by their white, non-Jewish peers. However, some of these challenges were framed in traditional Jewish terms. Questions of enslavement and emancipation, for instance, were often considered in biblical terms, including the practice of conversion of enslaved people to Judaism, as Jonathan Schorsch, among others, has written about extensively, and as I mentioned, was dealt with a bit already in Amsterdam. Additionally, in communities in Suriname, particularly Black and so-called mulatto Jews, and here when I'm using the term mulatto, I'm using the terminology at the time, Jews were formed under the same religious authority as the larger white Sephardic congregation, as historians Aviva Ben-Ur and Laura Liebman have looked at closely. Questions of racial and religious belonging tended to straddle the traditional Jewish understandings of Judaism and American realities of race. So if we can have the new slide. So this complicated relationship with halakha is seen in the fact that Jewish law states that a master who had sexual relations with an enslaved woman he owns must make a choice: free, convert, and marry her, or remove her from his possession. In other words, sell or manumit, so free her. But the very proliferation of mixed race, mulatto children, particularly in Suriname, shows, but also in other places, I have examples from Barbados, Jamaica, other places, shows that Sephardic men were ignoring halakha, this halakha, forbidding masters to have sex with it and sexual relations with enslaved women. I know of only a single case, and Jonathan Schorsch also talks about this case, of a rabbi chastising Jewish men for having sexual relations with enslaved women. Abraham Gabai Sidro was a rabbi in the Yoda Savannah, that's the Jews' savannah. This plantation settlement was founded in the 1680s in the interior of Suriname. In the 1730s, Rabbi Isidro lambasted some of the men there for their, quote, ease with women. He wrote in Spanish, facilidad con mujeres, and evil passions, negras pasiones. The Spanish pun, negras pasiones negras, making it likely that he had enslaved women in mind. Aviva Ben-Ur points out that he also had a lot of conflicts with people in the community. So that could have been behind his desire to call them out for their sexual relationships. But frequently, Surinamese Sephardic owners did not free their enslaved women as Jewish law demanded, even when freeing and making Jewish the children they had with them. There are many examples, but just one is the will of the planter Isaac da Costa, who died in 1734. His 6 mulatto children by various enslaved women were all to be made Jewish. But his will, by leaving out any statement of the mother's Jewishness, seems to indicate that da Costa did not convert any of these enslaved women themselves. That's why, if the slave-owning patriarch wanted his children to be Jewish, he had to have them made Jewish through traditional Jewish ritual, as Jewish law demanded. What we do know, though, is that this will is relatively exceptional. Most Sephardic men did not ritually convert their children with African-descended women, either enslaved or increasingly, through especially the 18th century, free women of color. Yet despite this missing halakhic ritual, some of these children were recognized as Jewish in the colony, whether ritually converted or not. It's very hard to estimate the number of these mixed race children who were recognized in some way as Jewish in Suriname. Jonathan Schorse estimates no more than 2, maybe 4% of the total enslaved population. Aviva Ben-Ur places it as high as 8%. Historian Vika Vink estimates around 10% of Jews were African descended, but granted, she's talking about the middle of the 19th century on the eve of abolition of slavery in 1863. We do know that there were enough of these mixed race children who were considered or considered themselves Jewish to found their own fraternity, Darhei Yesarim, or the Paths of Righteousness, which later, albeit very briefly, became a congregation in its own right. And it's hard to know how to interpret this development, especially because it was unique to Suriname. We don't find it in other places in the Caribbean, or not that I know of. And this is also the only colony in which Jews were involved in plantation agriculture to any large degree. In the other colonies, most Jews were mostly merchants. So the new slide, please. As the 18th century progressed and the community organized itself, this is the mixed race community, such as in the founding of this fraternity, Darhei Yesarim, this group of mixed race Jews became large enough to cause community leaders discomfort. Moreover, the fact that it was initially a fraternity, or sometimes termed a study group, and only later and with a lot of controversy became an actual congregation, illustrates the unease with which this group was viewed. Darhei Yesarim was founded in 1759, possibly, as can be seen from the Askamot, or the bylaws of the congregation shown on the screen, due to the increased stringency of the restrictions on mixed race Jews. There's been some interesting work done on these bylaws, Askamot, of the communities throughout the Americas by Ron Gomez Cáceres in Curacao, looking very closely at Curacao, tracing them through the centuries, and also Bruce Greenberg, who's working on, I think, starting his PhD, looking at samples of a few different communities, looking at the changes in the kind of societal pressures they were dealing with that become reflected in these communal bylaws. And we can see there in this slide as it goes throughout the 18th century, how much stricter they become when dealing with mixed race Jews. So we can see that while Jewishness in the Caribbean now clearly meant more than halakhic Judaism, white Sephardim and black or mixed race Sephardim, and I'm using that term to encompass the whole community, didn't seem to quite agree on what it meant. For mixed race Jews, it meant full inclusion in the community. For these white Sephardim, it didn't. And the white Sephardim persistently and ultimately successfully, as these Askamot show, worked to limit the African-descended Jews' rights and status. Interestingly, it was in the realm of Jewish religious ritual that these rights were most often limited, such as restricting their choices in marriage, in burial, and other areas of ritual practice, as historian Jonathan Schwarz has noted. Mixed race Jews were not called to read from the Torah during services. They were limited in where they could sit in the synagogue, were defined as congregantes rather than Yehidim, so essentially second rather than first-class members of the congregation. And the mixed race Jews complained actually to the colonial officials in the late 18th century, but to no avail. In almost all cases, colonial officials didn't want to deal with anything with the Jewish communities unless they really had to. Jewish communities have been given autonomy, and colonial officials just didn't want to deal with it. In the end, the Darhei Yesarim community was forced to disband in 1817, and the mixed race Jews were folded into or forcibly absorbed into the white Sephardic congregation. Although the best and most studied examples of what Aviva Ben-Ur evocatively calls this peripheral inclusion were Suriname, like this case I've been talking about the Darhei Yesarim, these same dynamics also played out in Barbados, as historian Carl Watson reminds us. In Barbados, the preamble to what they call the Hebrew Vestry Act of 1821 stated that, and I quote, "No person whose original extraction shall be proved to have been from a Negro shall be deemed or allowed to choose or be chosen as a vestryman under this act," unquote. And this demonstrates both the anxieties around mixed race Jews and that the white Sephardim were following the Caribbean colonies' racialized structures in many cases, sometimes in addition to, sometimes in contradiction to Jewish law. So next slide. So to give a face literally to the discussion, I'd like to talk briefly about the people in the picture. That is Maria Louisa de Hart and her husband Johannes Ellis. It was taken in 1845, soon after their marriage. Johannes was born in Ghana, but Maria was born in Paramaribo, the capital of Suriname. Her father, Moses Meyer de Hart, was born in 1793 in Amsterdam to Ashkenazi parents. He came to Suriname around 1810 and bought a sugar and a coffee plantation. There he married Carolina Petronella van der Hart, who was one of the enslaved people on his plantation. He freed her and he married her. They had 12 children, including Maria, who you see in the slide. Carolina never converted to Judaism, but Maria and many of her siblings and their descendants considered themselves and were considered Jewish. And I should say I'm grateful to Laura Lehman for this information and the daguerreotype, the early picture of Maria and Johannes. By the time Maria was born, about 10% of Surinamese Jews had some African ancestry, if we're going by Vika Vink's estimates. In any case, no matter what the precise number was, as the Surinamese author Cynthia McLeod once said in an interview, quote, "Shake a Surinamese family tree and a Jew falls out," unquote. While this quote refers to Suriname, a similar sort of dynamic was at play in other Caribbean colonies as well. So new slide. So the British author, William Makepeace Thackeray's Vanity Fair, written in 1848, offers a well-known example of how Jewishness and the Caribbean became associated with one another in the 19th century. Thackeray describes his character, Miss Rhoda Schwartz, and pictured on the slide as she was in the original illustrations for the book. Notice the sort of almost caricature of her features. He describes her as, and I quote, "the rich, woolly-haired mulatto from St. Kitts. Her father was a German Jew, a slave owner, they say, connected with the Cannibal Islands in some way or other," unquote. So Thackeray's account of Schwartz's origins reflects the historical presence, albeit in relatively small numbers, of Jewish slaveholders throughout the Caribbean colonial world, as I've been talking about. But also it reflects their descendants and their mixed race descendants as well. So their connections to the region are registered not only by European authors, such as Thackeray, but also by colonial and post-colonial Caribbean authors, as the excellent work of Sarah Phillips Castile delves into. And this is far more than an interesting historical footnote. While Caribbean Jewry may seem obscure, a niche that keeps historians like me employed, looking at Jewish communities in the Caribbean throughout the centuries has, I believe, a great deal to teach us about today's conception of race, belonging, Jewish identity, and the legacies of colonialism. So now I'd like to zoom out a bit and think about what all this could mean for Jewish communities today. Because the defining lines of racial power between white and non-white in the Caribbean, I think, have overshadowed the study of white, what we call ethnic minorities in this space. Recently, work on Jewish populations in the Caribbean, like I've done, but all these wonderful scholars I've mentioned throughout my talk have also done. But also there's emerging scholarship on white minorities such as the Irish. Yet the broad divide in historiographical interest between those who were victims of colonialism in the Caribbean and those who benefited from it doesn't easily accommodate the study of groups like the Jews or the Irish. The particular, and what we could say even is like a stubborn riddle of both groups, is that they fell on both sides of this divide. They're identified by an ethnic label, Jew, Irish, and as white, but not white. Looking at Jews in the Caribbean is characterized by significant ambiguities with respect to race and power. Jews were, according to historian Jonathan Israel's eloquent phrase, quote, both agents and victims of empire, unquote. Early modern Jews participated in the colonial project as merchants, brokers, and more rarely as traders and enslaved people and as planters, as I've been talking about. In some cases, Jews enjoyed new freedoms in the Caribbean colonies that had been unavailable to them in Europe, such as was seen in the Essequibo Liberties. Most notably, the Jewish agricultural settlement of Yoda Savannah, Jews Savannah, was granted near autonomy by the colonial authorities, as Aviva Ben-Ur's work, and particularly her book, shows. Yet colonial Jewry also suffered from renewed or continuing forms of oppression in the Caribbean in the form of special taxes and limits on property ownership and voting rights, occasional flare-ups of anti-Semitism. In Jamaica, as historian Jane Gerber notes, Jews acquired full civil rights only in 1831, 6 months after the free blacks and only 3 years before the general abolition of slavery. All of which illustrates that the status of Jewishness with respect to the forces of colonization remains difficult to define. So next slide. In fact, historical evidence suggests that colonial Jewry both challenged and supported the Caribbean colonial project. For example, in his book on the Haitian Revolution, historian Philippe Girard recounts the story of Isaac Sasportas, a Sephardic merchant who revered the French Revolution because it had proclaimed the civil emancipation of the Jews. In 1799, Sasportas developed a plan to export the revolution to Jamaica, where he hoped to foment a revolt of enslaved people. He traveled to Jamaica for that purpose, where he was arrested, convicted of treason, and hanged after his plan was leaked. And on the slide, you can see a caricature that at the time was made of him. Oh no, we go back to the other slide.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. A half century later, Sidney Levine, and you see the picture of him there in the middle of the slide, a Jewish owner and editor of the Jamaican newspaper, the County Union, was imprisoned in the months following the Morant Bay Rebellion, which began in 1865. He was accused of fomenting the revolt with the help of his newspaper, and Levine was punished by the governor of the island after the rebellion was subdued. In other cases, however, colonial Jewry helped to squash enslaved revolts from enslaved people and Maroons. So Maroons are escaped enslaved people who went to live in the interior. They're particularly present in Jamaica and in Suriname. We learn from the historical essay of the colony of Suriname, originally written in French, published by the Surinamese Jewish community in 1788. The authors of this essay, and it was sort of described as being jointly authored by a lot of people, The authors of the essay proudly note their military contributions to the efforts to suppress the Maroons, asserting that the Jewish colonists, and I quote, equal the Christians in courage, in discipline, and in their burning zeal to serve the colony, unquote. As evidence of the strength of the Sephardic community's devotion to the colony, the essay includes a description of Captain David Cohen Nassi's 1743 victorious attack against the Maroons, which was carried out even though it fell on Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the Jewish year. Such conflicting examples leave us wondering whether figures such as Sesportus and Levine were outliers in Caribbean Jewish communities in their resistance to colonial power. This all reflects the ambiguous position that Jews occupied in colonial Caribbean hierarchies, somewhere in between the ruling white classes, because keep in mind, in the Dutch Caribbean at least, they make up a half to a third of the white population, and the colored, as they were referred to at the time, and enslaved classes. Jewish difference, with its tendency to destabilize racial and other categories of identity, might be understood as a threat to the homogeneity and therefore potentially capable of undermining colonial authority. Conversely, Jewishness might be read as participating in and shoring up white power, or as aspiring to do so. I think we see some echoes of these tensions in relation to discussions around Jewish power, Jewish relations to power, and Jewish minorizations today. So now we have the new slide. Thank you. What I think looking at the history of the Caribbean teaches us, and that's also particularly relevant for today, is that Jewish, African, Asian, and other cultures in the Caribbean are not mutually exclusive. Rather, these cultures have been deeply connected to one another for the last 300 years. Take, for example, the development of Creole languages. The earliest known document written in Papiamento, a vibrant Creole language that today is spoken by 200,000 people of all ethnicities, all social classes in the Dutch Caribbean islands of Curacao, Aruba, Bonaire, is a fragment of a 1775 love letter between two Sephardic Jews who were living in Curacao. They wrote the first written evidence we have of Papiamento in the late 18th century. In an essay on Creole languages in colonial Suriname, historian Natalie Zeeman Davis, of blessed memory, explains that in the late 17th century, a distinctive Creole language developed on Jewish-owned plantations. It incorporated Portuguese and African lexicons, as well as English words. This Creole, known as Jutango, or the Jewish tongue, traveled with these enslaved people who managed to escape enslavement on the Jewish plantations. The anthropologist Richard Price details in his ethnography of Maroons in Suriname how, because of patterns of Jewish settlement and slaveholding there, the Hebrew term treif entered the Creole Srontongo language and was used and actually still refers to food taboos. Other Jewish cultural practices, such as cleansing after menstruation, also were adopted by some Maroon groups who had been exposed to them while living on Jewish-owned plantations. The extensive scholarship on Black Jewish relations, and indeed research into Jews of color, has traditionally focused on the United States, as the Pew Research study I started my talk with illustrates. However, the Caribbean's an important alternative site, I think, in which to anchor and reframe discussions of these relations. The history of the Caribbean highlights both the historical convergence of African, Jewish, and other diasporic and indigenous populations since the 17th century, but also, as the scholar Sarah Phillips Castale and Heidi Kaufman have demonstrated in an edited volume they put out a few years ago, the resonances among Black and Jewish cultural narratives of oppression, migration, and survival, again, especially in literatures from the Caribbean. Indeed, the Caribbean context from which the sociological and anthropological concepts hybridity and creolization most famously emerged confounds distinctions between the categories of Jewish and non-Jewish, Black and white. The Black-Jewish relations discussion in the United States, for example, has tended to present Black and Jew as sharply delineated categories, sometimes in alliance with each other, such as during the civil rights struggles of the 1950s and 1960s, sometimes seemingly in opposition to each other in more recent decades. Caribbean history and what might be termed Caribbean Jewishness, again drawing on Sarah Phillips Castell's terms, that, however, calls binary constructions of this kind into question. By looking to the history of Caribbean Jewish communities, how they grappled with exclusion, inclusion, hierarchies, halakha, race, and the inherent contradictions of colonialism, I think we can learn a great deal that can help us as we confront new challenges in our own 21st century communities. And last picture, last slide. So if you'll allow me just a minute to draw one more historical parallel, or rather argue for the utility of history for the present, before we begin with the questions in our discussion. I'm giving my talk from my study in Leiden, where I live. I've lived in Leiden for 21 of the 25 years that I've lived in the Netherlands. I'm a proud alum of the University of Leiden myself. As Chaya mentioned, I received my PhD in 2009 with a century's worth of stern-looking university deans and rectors and presidents staring down at me in the Senatskammer. I'm not only a proud alum of Leiden University, however, I'm also a proud Leidenaar. I try to imitate the accent. I celebrate 3 October every year. For those of you all who are not alums of the University of Leiden, or who aren't familiar with the history of Leiden, this is the local commemoration of the liberation of Leiden from the Spaniards in 1574. This folk festival involves, among other things, eating herring and white bread, which you can see on the slide. This was supposedly the first food the starving inhabitants of the city received after the besieging Spaniards were driven away during the 80 Years' War between Spain and the Dutch Republic. The University of Leiden was founded soon after in 1575, as we've heard, thanks to William of Orange. According to tradition, he founded the university to reward the citizens of Leiden for their resistance to the Spanish occupiers. This long tradition of defending liberty continued through the centuries with Professor Cleveringa, as we've heard, who protested the dismissal of his Jewish colleagues, especially Professor Meyer, in 1940 in a famous speech or a lecture and a protest for which he was imprisoned. Therefore, it's meaningful for me as a resident of this wonderful city and a graduate of this fine university, like so many of you all, to give this talk this evening. It's also particularly poignant for me as a Jew who teaches at a Dutch university, albeit no longer in Leiden, to give this talk. I'm honored to memorialize the bravery of Professor Cleveringa. But I have to wonder, as my lectures are disrupted by protesters, as I'm threatened by students, as I avoid going to the university campus at all if it's not absolutely necessary, as I tuck my Star of David necklace under my shirt as I enter the university buildings, I wonder when, where, or if my non-Jewish colleagues will show Professor Cleveringa's courage. So that's what I have to say, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you very much, Jessica. This was a very interesting speech. And if there is anyone who posted something in the chat, no. Is there anyone who wants to ask a question?
So
Doesn't look like it.
I can't see
Oh, here.
people are raising their hands.
Comment.
I can put them in the
Very interesting lecture.
Yeah. If you have a question, yes? Who
Can
is
I
this?
ask a personal question? Do you teach in Dutch?
Yeah.
Of course, you could ask. I do teach some classes in Dutch and some in English. It depends on the class. A lot of the first year bachelor's level classes are in Dutch. All master's classes are now in English, so it depends on the class.
I have a question from the earlier contact with you. I understood that there is a discussion in the United States about a growing number of Jews of color in the communities. Can you tell something about that shortly?
About the discussion in the US?
Yes.
Yeah, this report, this Pew Research Center report caused a lot of controversy. People were surprised by how many people identified as Jews of color. I didn't get into all the methodology, but there was some question raised about the methodology. It was how people identified themselves. It also included people who didn't answer or said they didn't want to say. There was also some discussion around how you would define, quote, Hispanic Jews. As part of various migrations, there's very large Jewish communities in Brazil, in Argentina. Some of those are defined as or define themselves as Sephardic, others Ashkenazi, but in the American context, basically anyone coming from Latin America is considered Hispanic, and therefore with some of these methodologies might be considered a Jew of color. So yeah, there was a lot of controversy around this report, but there was also a lot of questions about what it meant. As I mentioned, if by the end of this decade 15% of Jews are Jews of color, yeah, what does that mean for communities? How are they going to have to change? I think it made a lot of people uncomfortable. And I don't know, I think sometimes we can see that here in the Netherlands as well with some communities. How inclusive are we? How closely do we follow halakha, etc.?
I see another question now. Is it
Not the
you?
question was
Yeah, yeah.
comment. Yeah.
Oh, it's not so much a question. As a Dutch living in Israel, I was really struck by what you said at the end. Who is this ZU? Is it possible to identify?
I have no idea.
Oh, that's okay. Or people can contact me. I'm easily Googleable if people want to contact me at my work address at the Vrije Universiteit. Yeah, I really debated about saying that, but I felt like I had to, because as Benjamin talked about at the beginning, we're talking about the legacy of a very brave professor, and I hope we can see his legacy of courage continued to the present day. I unfortunately myself personally haven't seen a lot of it.
Sorry, this wasn't me. I'm Maya. I just put my kids to sleep, and that's why I had to be quiet, and I could only sorry, I just put on the video. Hi, sorry. I was putting my kids down to sleep while I was listening to the lecture, and I was just I thought it was a very interesting lecture. Thank you very much. And I would just I don't really have a question. I guess if there is a possibility to put this lecture up somewhere so I can listen to it again. I admit I wasn't like 100% concentrated, but it was very. I've always been fascinated by the history of the Jews in the Caribbean, and but yes, I was really struck by what you. I've been living in Israel for 11 years now. I'm an alumni of the Vrije Universiteit. I've studied law there, and I'm just I'm shocked. I'm really you hear it on the news and everything, but when you actually hear it from someone who's working or studying at the university from a personal experience, we always think like, well, maybe it's not that bad, but when you actually hear a personal experience, it becomes real. So I'm really sorry about that.
Hi, can
Yeah.
somebody hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, my name is Robert. I enjoyed your lecture, especially since we have lived on Curacao for 6 years. And this nice coincidence. As far as I found out about my ancestors, they moved from Basque Country to Portugal, and then they split up. One part went directly to via Recife to Curacao, and my direct lineage went via Venice to Amsterdam. So when we lived on Curacao, my full name was Barzilai de Pinedo. Pinedo was a town in Basque Country, and the families in Curacao took away the Barzilai, and my ancestors took away the Pinedo. But we are related, and it was very interesting to find out. It's a very interesting community, especially the history and the synagogue. I must say, I'm not a religious person, but when we lived there, I was there every weekend, every Shabbat, with the kids. Another interesting thing I learned is the reason that the Jews that came from Portugal were not all the Jews, they were not always from Portugal. A lot of them came from Spain, actually the majority, but they wanted to be called Portuguese Jews because, as you mentioned, there was just the 80 years war ongoing at that time. And they don't want to be related as Spaniards to the invaders. So that's why a lot of Spanish Jews I know from other families I heard, they became Portuguese Jews just to protect themselves. But overall, I must say, I found your presentation very interesting, especially about Suriname. I've been there a few times when I lived in Curacao, and they still have a very small community. Also in Curacao, you know, from 2,000 people, it went down to 200 at the moment. Most of them left for the States and back to the Netherlands, or back to the Netherlands. For them, it was the first time. But again, Curacao is interesting. I recommend everyone to visit and to visit the synagogue and the museum and the cemetery and the old Jewish companies that still exist, the bank, the ice cream factory, the liquor factory. It's a lot of Jewish history there. But again, thank you very much for your presentation.
No, thanks for also adding your personal experience. I was going to put in a plug also for the museum. They're getting the museum up off doing great work. Also on Curacao, there's the Mongi Maduro Library and Museum, which has a great resource for not just Jewish history in the Caribbean, but Caribbean history. And yeah, indeed, I was just in Suriname the end of January, had Shabbat at the synagogue there, lovely, warm, welcoming community. And I actually, especially during these difficult times, found it deeply moving to be there in a synagogue with the white sand floors, with a community that's been there for hundreds of years, you know, out in the jungle, still having our Shabbat.
I had my bar mitzvah there.
Okay.
So
yeah, it's a very interesting community. And also, there's a Jewish cooking book printed in Curacao. And I must say, Pesach is coming, and the best geroset in the world is the Curacao geroset. We eat it every year. But yeah, it's an interesting island, interesting history. And also with the slavery, the Jewish families there were much less involved in slave trade, because they were not owners of plantations. They were primarily business people. But it's not that nobody was involved, but much less than the Protestants on the island. And as people might think, the Jews there were not really all that wealthy compared to the local Protestants. They were much wealthier than the Jews, and the Jews had to pay more tax than the Protestants. So that was even more harmful for the Jewish living on Curacao at that time. But try to get that cooking book. It's very good.
great. Other questions, comments, people?
Yeah, I have a question, Jessica. I don't know if you can hear me. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, I think
okay.
we hear you. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Jessica, I often hear that education could be the solution to the problems of anti-Semitism. I'm not that optimistic about that. because if you don't want to be educated, nothing will be helpful. But I'm curious, what are your thoughts about this? Do you think that education is a solution of the problems we currently have in Holland? Not only in Holland, all over the world, as a result of the problems in October 23.
I don't know. I wish I had an answer. It's something I've thought about a lot anyway. Right now I'm teaching my Intro to Jews and Judaism class to first-year students at the Vrije Universiteit. And what I'm struck by, and I know, teachers for millennia have been saying this, I'm struck by how little the students know.
No.
And I don't mean that as being negative towards my students, because I have really, not everyone, but I have really very involved, engaged, nice students in general, I have to say. And I think, and this is particularly now I'm talking about the Dutch context. I think because there are so few Jews in the Netherlands, and again, actually I'm talking from the Dutch context, but also my background as an American, where half the world's Jews live in America, or almost half, the other half in Israel, with the rest of us scattered a little bit around. As Chaya mentioned in the introduction, I grew up in Kentucky, the Bible Belt. But yeah, there are Jews and pretty strong Jewish community. I'm giving a talk for them at the end of April, actually. I'm struck in comparison with Bible Belt rural America, still how much more the kids I grew up with knew about Jews and Judaism than the first year students at the Vrije University, or I think university. Jews have a much bigger presence in the US. We're much more, present in popular culture, etc. So on one hand, I think education can help if it's the broader sense of education, meeting other Jews, talking to Jews. I'm not sure it always works particularly well. In fact, I think it can sometimes backfire a bit if it's only focused on zielig, to use the Dutch word, sort of pathetic, sad Jews, and only, I'm not saying that education about the Shoah or Holocaust education isn't important, because I think it is. But I think that only focusing on, zielig Joden, sad Jews who were, killed and exterminated, and so we shouldn't dislike Jews, doesn't really compute for people who are so far removed from that. I mean, we may still know people or have grandparents or even parents who survived the Shoah, but younger people just don't. And I think it feels way too distant. So I think, and if we're talking about education, it's about meeting people. I think the initiatives of various people I know to go talk to students. I've been involved. There's a program started in Amsterdam, but we also have it. I'm a member of the congregation in The Hague. Learn to Know Your Neighbor program. And, I also understand why people after 7 October and everything that's happened in the Netherlands, they call it dialoogmoe, so tired of having a dialogue. I don't think it needs to solely be the responsibility of Jews, but I think education, basically, to get back to your question, education, but not just about Jews this, and the Holocaust was really bad, so don't hate Jews. Like, I don't think that does much. Again, I'm not making fun of all the really great efforts people are making. I think it needs to be more engaged, more actual, more based on meeting people and talking to people.
Thank you for.
Sorry.
Thank you.
No, I was going to say, but I'm also feeling a bit cynical about education of any sort. I wish I weren't, but I kind of am.
It's sad to see that the level of education in Holland the last 30 or 40 years dropped dramatically. And there are a lot of reasons for that. We cannot go into details here. But I think you are right. It should be a more broader attention for education. Education in a more broader sense. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. what's the meaning of Dakootje?
Dakootje, I am Marina da Costa from Suriname.
Aha.
I just came in. I had visitors from abroad who came over and overruled me. So I missed your lecture, and
So
I
did I.
really
Can you hear it somewhere? Can you hear it somewhere?
We
hope-
will publish the video on the
great.
website of the Irgoen Olei Holland.
Oh, wow.
Okay.
So
But I want to tell all the people who are in this Zoom meeting to find me on LinkedIn, Marina da Costa. I am a tour operator and I'm specialized in Joden Savannah and the Jewish history of Suriname. So hopefully once I can meet a couple of you here in Suriname.
I want to say that Marina was lovely when I was in Suriname at the end of January, and gave me a ride back to my hotel and introduced me to people at the synagogue. So, hi, Marina. Good to talk.
Hi, Jessica. Finally, I came in.
great.
So, okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I think we have to conclude now, and it was very interesting lecture, Jessica, and we thank you a lot for it. I also thank the public, and especially the other lecturer, because he gave a lecture, Benjamin Anker. Really, everybody spoke with his heart or her heart, and I'm very happy about that, especially because of the meaning of this lecture, the significance. So now I close. We are going to close, and I wish you all Laila Tov. And yes,
And we wish you a Pesach Sameach
we will
as
be
much
in
as we can.
contact.
Akushere Pesach.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, thank you all.
Okay. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
See you all.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.